She was standing right there when he walked in, and every single person in that room assumed he would walk right past her. They were wrong. In a settlement where a woman's worth was measured by the curve of her smile and the softness of her hands, Ruth Mercer had long since accepted her place at the edges of things, invisible, overlooked. The daughter nobody talked about when strangers came asking, but the day Cole Brennan pushed open the door of the Mercer trading post and let his eyes move slowly across the room, something shifted, something that would unravel everything her mother had planned, humiliate her sister, and drag Ruth herself into a wilderness she was completely unprepared for. Drop a comment with your city. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit like if you're staying till the end. The Mercer trading post smelled like leather and wood smoke, and something underneath both of those things. The particular odor of a business that was losing ground. It was the smell of old inventory that hadn't moved in months, of lamp oil burned too late into the night over ledgers that never quite balanced, of flour sacks stacked against the back wall with too much patience and not enough buyers. Ruth Mercer had grown up inside that smell. She knew it the way she knew the sound of the floorboard near the front door, the one that groaned like a complaint every time someone stepped on it, and the way the afternoon light came through the west-facing window at an angle that made the dust motes visible for exactly 40 minutes before the sun dropped too low. She knew this building the way people only know places they've worked in since they were old enough to carry something without being asked. She was behind the counter when the first frost of October arrived, tallying up a column of numbers that refused to cooperate. The pen in her hand had a bent nib that dragged slightly on the downstroke, and she'd been meaning to replace it for 2 weeks, but replacing it meant spending 4 cents, and 4 cents was not something she spent carelessly in October of 1858. Outside, the settlement of Harlan's Crossing was doing what it always did in the weeks before winter, contracting, pulling itself inward. Families who'd spent the summer spread across their properties came closer to their hearths. Men who'd been working the far pastures showed up at the post for supplies they'd put off buying. The mood was not exactly festive. It was the mood of people doing math in their heads and not liking what they came up with. Ruth understood that math better than most. She set her pen down and pressed her thumb against the bridge of her nose. The numbers in the ledger were not lying, which was the problem. The post had taken in $42.16 in September. Their outstanding debts to the supply merchant in Billings came to $78 even. Her mother had been avoiding that particular page of the ledger for 3 weeks, which was her way of handling things she didn't want to be true. The bell above the front door rattled, not the musical little chime it was supposed to make, but the harsh clatter it made when someone pushed the door too hard. Ruth looked up. It was only Tom Hadley, the blacksmith's oldest boy, coming in for nails. She told him the price without looking it up. He counted out the coins with the slow deliberation of someone who'd been told not to lose them, and left. The bell clattered again on his way out. Ruth went back to the ledger. She was 26 years old. She had her father's dark hair and her mother's stubbornness and a scar along her left jawline that she'd stopped trying to hide when she was about 15, having concluded that the effort of hiding it required more energy than she had to spare. The scar came from a fall when she was 8, a horse, a moment of bad judgment, a wooden fence post. It had healed crooked, pulling the skin tight in a way that made her look, when she was tired, like she was bracing for something. Most days she was. The door to the back room opened, and her mother came through it carrying a bolt of blue calico fabric that she held in front of herself like a shield. Eleanor Mercer was 51 and carried her age in the particular way of women who had once been beautiful and were still, in certain lights, somewhat close to it. She had Vivian's cheekbones, or rather, Vivian had hers, and she moved through spaces as though they ought to rearrange themselves around her. Even now, in a struggling trading post in a frontier settlement in Montana Territory, she carried herself like a woman who expected to be looked at. "I'm thinking of putting the calico in the window," Eleanor said, without greeting, because she and Ruth had been in the same building since breakfast, and greetings were for company. "We've had that bolt for 6 months," Ruth said, "which is why it needs to go in the window." "Nobody's buying fabric in October, Mama. They're buying nails and salt and lamp oil." Eleanor set the bolt on the counter with a sound that said the conversation wasn't really about fabric. She smoothed her hand along the blue cloth, looking at it without seeing it. Then she said, "I heard Cole Brennan is coming through." Ruth wrote down a number in the ledger. "Heard that too." He was in Billings last month, traded a season's worth of furs for nearly $200. Eleanor let that number sit in the air between them. $200, Ruth? Good for him. He's not married. Ruth set her pen down again, this time with more deliberation. She looked at her mother directly. Eleanor was looking at the calico. He's coming to the post? Ruth asked. He's coming to Harlan's Crossing. He'll need supplies. That's what they say. Eleanor smoothed the fabric again. He's been trapping up in the North Range for 3 seasons without a wife. Men like that, they start thinking about settling. Men like what? Successful men. Men who've got something to come home to. Eleanor finally looked up. Vivian is going to wear the green dress. I pressed it this morning. Ruth understood the entire conversation then. She turned back to the ledger. That's fine. You might consider... I'm fine, Mama. The silence that followed was not comfortable, but it was familiar. Eleanor picked up the calico bolt and went back through the door, and Ruth sat alone with the numbers again. $42 in September, $78 owed. Outside, the wind was starting to come down from the north with a mean edge to it, the kind that promised serious weather before Christmas. She picked up her pen with the bent nib and went back to work. Vivian Mercer came downstairs at 10:30 wearing the green dress. She came into the front of the post the way she always came into rooms, not quickly, not loudly, but with a kind of deliberate ease that made it seem like she'd timed her arrival to be noticed. She was 22, 4 years younger than Ruth, and she was the daughter that people meant when they said the Mercer girl. Not cruel about it, exactly, just specific. She had light eyes and her mother's cheekbones and hands that had never been roughened by much harder work than sorting ribbon. She was not lazy, exactly. She helped in the post, she kept the book sometimes, she could cook competently enough, but there was about Vivian a quality of existing slightly above the level at which hard things happened, as though difficulty were a weather system that moved around her rather than through her. You heard? Vivian said, coming to lean against the counter beside Ruth. About Brennan. Yes. Mama's been talking about nothing else since yesterday. Vivian picked up a small tin of peppermints from the display near the register, considered it, set it back. She's got it all planned out. I smile at him, he buys supplies, he decides he can't live without me. We're married by spring. Ruth said nothing. You think it's ridiculous, Vivian said. I think Mama worries about the post. Mama worries about everything. Vivian turned to face her sister, resting her elbow on the counter. You think he'll come? People usually do when they need supplies and we're the closest post. You know what I mean. Ruth looked at her sister. Vivian's expression was harder to read than people gave her credit for. She was not stupid, and she was not entirely comfortable with the role she'd been assigned any more than Ruth was comfortable with hers. But she was used to it in a way Ruth wasn't. She'd grown up understanding that her face was a kind of currency, and she'd made a kind of peace with spending it. I don't know what you mean, Ruth said, which was not quite a lie. Vivian sighed. I'm just saying, if he comes in and he's decent and he's got $200, Mama's going to push. Hard. She pushes hard regardless. Harder than usual. She told me this morning that this might be our last chance. Ruth's jaw tightened, just slightly, the scar pulling. Last chance for what? For the post. For the family. Vivian's voice had gone quieter. She showed me the ledger, Ruth. She showed you the... Ruth stopped. She never shows me the ledger when she's looking at it. I have to find it. She wanted me to understand the stakes. Vivian said it without malice. That was perhaps the most complicated thing about Vivian. She was not cruel. She simply existed in a world that had arranged itself around her convenience, and she had never thought much to question the arrangement. I'm not saying it's fair. I'm just saying I know. Ruth looked at the front door. The wind pushed against it from outside. Wear the green dress, Ruth said. Look nice. If he wants to buy supplies and make conversation, that's fine. But don't let Mama sell you like cattle at an auction. Vivian laughed, a short surprise sound. Listen to you. I mean it. I know you do. Vivian straightened up, smoothing the green fabric over her hips. You always mean everything. That's your whole problem. You know that. Ruth picked up her pen. I've been told. He came in at 2 p.m. Ruth heard the bell, that harsh clatter, and looked up from the crate she was unpacking in the corner of the main room. She'd been pulling out tins of sardines and stacking them on the shelf, a job that required no particular attention and could be done while her mind stayed on the numbers in the ledger. The man who came through the door was not what she'd expected, though she couldn't have said exactly what she had expected. Cole Brennan was somewhere around 30. He was not remarkable to look at, not in the way that would make you stop what you were doing and stare. He was tall, but not extraordinarily so, broad through the shoulders in the way of a man who did physical work because it was required rather than to be impressive about it. His coat was heavy canvas, patched at one elbow, and his boots were the boots of someone who actually walked in them. He had a short, dark beard, badly in need of trimming, and he moved through the doorway with the particular careful awareness of someone who spent most of his time in spaces where carelessness had consequences. He looked around the post once, the whole room, the way you look at a landscape when you're reading weather. His eyes passed over Ruth. Then he came to the counter. Vivian was behind the counter. She'd stationed herself there sometime around noon, after her mother had spent 20 minutes coaching her on the positioning. She smiled at him, the smile she'd practiced, warm and not too eager, and said, "Welcome to Mercer's. What can I help you with?" Cole Brennan reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He set it on the counter. "Supply list. I'm heading back up to the North Range after the weather clears. Should be 10 days or so before the next storm system. I want to be restocked before then." Vivian looked at the list. Her smile held, but something around her eyes changed. The list was long, written in a cramped, practical hand, and it was the list of a man who knew exactly what he needed and had no patience for being upsold. "We have most of this," she said. "The salt pork, the flour, lamp oil?" "Yes. The number 4 traps. I'd have to check our inventory." "I'll need 6. I can check." Vivian turned to look into the back room, and then turned back. "My sister would know better where they're stocked." "Ruth?" Ruth was already setting down the tin of sardines. She came to the counter, wiping her hands on her apron, and took the supply list from Vivian without preamble. She read it quickly. "We have 4 number 4 new house traps in the back," she said. 2 are from last season's stock. Good condition. 2 are new. If you need 6, I can send to Billings, but that's a 2-week wait." Cole looked at her. Not the look that men in Harlan's Crossing usually gave her. The brief flicker of appraisal followed by the decision to look at something else. He looked at her the way he'd looked at the room when he came in, like he was reading information. 4 will do if they're sound," he said. "Can I see them?" "You can." She led him to the back room. This was not standard practice. Eleanor would have something to say about it later. But the alternative was describing the traps through Vivian, who had never closely inspected a new house trap in her life, and whose description would have been both polite and useless. The back room was crowded with crates and barrels, and the particular organized chaos of a working inventory. Ruth went directly to the shelf where the traps were stored and pulled down the first one. She handed it to Cole without preamble. He took it and worked the mechanism twice, checking the spring tension and the jaw alignment. He turned it over, found the spot where the previous owner had repaired a crack in the pan with a twist of wire. "That'll hold," he said. "Who did the repair?" "My father. Before he died." She handed him the second trap. 4 years ago. He checked that one too, then the newer ones. He worked methodically and without unnecessary comment, and she stood beside him in the cluttered back room and let him work. Most men, in her experience, wanted to fill silences with something. Cole Brennan apparently didn't mind them. "These are fine," he said finally. He was looking at the last trap, but his attention had shifted somehow. "You know your inventory." "It's my inventory to know." He looked at her then, a direct look, and she met it without flinching because she'd grown up learning not to flinch. "How long have you been running this post?" "Since my father got sick. About 5 years." She paused. "I run it with my mother." "Your mother and your sister?" "My mother does the accounts when she wants to. My sister handles customers." She said it plainly without complaint or apology. "I do most of the rest." Something shifted in his expression. She couldn't have named it precisely. It wasn't pity, and it wasn't admiration exactly. It was something more like the look you get when something you'd suspected turns out to be true. "I'll take everything on the list that you have," he said, "and I'll come back for the other 2 traps if I can wait on the Billings order." 2 weeks minimum, she said, possibly 3 this time of year with the weather. He nodded, and they went back out to the front. What happened next took about 45 minutes. Cole Brennan brought his horse around to the side entrance, and Ruth and Vivian, and eventually Eleanor, who had materialized from somewhere upstairs with the determined energy of a woman who'd been waiting, loaded his supplies. It was not a glamorous process. The flour alone came in two 50-pound bags, and the salt pork had to be wrapped properly in oilcloth. Ruth did most of the physical work without thinking much about it, handing things to Cole when he reached for them, answering his questions when he had them. Eleanor circled the whole operation like a hawk, watching something from a height. She inserted herself into the conversation when Cole mentioned the North Range, expressing fascinated ignorance about the trapping trade in a way that was clearly intended to get him talking. Cole obliged, but briefly. He answered what was asked and didn't elaborate unnecessarily. He was not unfriendly. He was just specific. Vivian handed him things and smiled. She was genuinely good at this. The easy manner, the light comment that put people at ease. Even Cole, who seemed largely immune to charm offensives, softened slightly when she said something dry about the weather. He almost smiled. Ruth watched him almost smile and kept loading supplies. When everything was secured to his pack horse, Cole came back inside to settle his account. Ruth was behind the counter already, the numbers written out on a slip of paper. He looked at it, reached into his coat, and counted out the bills and coins exactly. No bargaining, no hemming. He knew what things cost, and he paid it. "Good stock," he said, "better than I expected." "We try," Ruth said. Eleanor was beside her now with the smile she used for important customers. "We'd love to see you back when you come down from the range, Mr. Brennan. We always have room at the table for a neighbor." Cole glanced at her, then at Vivian, then briefly at Ruth. "Appreciate that," he said. He picked up his change. Ruth had given him correct change, which he checked once, quickly, and put it in his pocket. "I'll be back in 6 to 8 weeks, weather dependent." He left. The bell clattered. Eleanor was already talking before the door closed completely. He looked at Vivian twice. "Did you see that? Twice." "He looked at the supply list twice," Ruth said. "He's an organized man." "Ruth." Eleanor turned to her with the expression she wore when Ruth was being deliberately difficult. "He's exactly what I've been. He's a customer, Mama. He's a successful unmarried man who just spent $11 in this post." "And he might come back in 6 to 8 weeks and spend another 11, Ruth said. "That would be good for the post. That's all it needs to be." Eleanor pressed her lips together. Vivian was looking out the window at the road where Cole Brennan's horse was moving up toward the north end of Harlan's Crossing, getting smaller. "He seemed kind," Vivian said, more to the window than to either of them. "He seemed like a man who knows what he wants," Eleanor said, and then went back upstairs. He came back in 6 weeks and 4 days, which was a Saturday in late November. The temperature had dropped to something serious by then. Ruth had spent the previous week doing the kind of inventory that told you exactly how worried to be. And she was exactly as worried as the numbers suggested she should be. 3 more accounts had gone unpaid. A family named Wickfield had moved east and left a debt of $8 that Ruth had crossed off the books with a hard line. The bolt of blue calico in the window had not sold. She was splitting wood behind the post when she heard horses on the road. She kept splitting. People came and went on the road all day, and it was none of her business unless they turned into the yard. They turned into the yard. Cole Brennan looked different after 6 weeks in the North Range. Not worse exactly, but stripped down to something more essential. The beard was longer. There was a weariness around his eyes that hadn't been there in October, the kind that came from weeks of hard work and cold and solitude. He had 2 pack horses with him this time, both loaded, and he led them into the yard with the particular care of a man whose animals were also his livelihood. He saw her before she said anything. "Miss Mercer," he said, reining in his horse. "Mr. Brennan." She set down her axe and pulled off her work gloves. "Good season?" "Fair." He swung down from his horse with the stiffness of a man who'd been riding since before first light. "Traps held. Lost a week to weather in early November. Overall, fair. You'll want to resupply." "I will, and—" He paused, and she noticed the pause because he was not a man who paused before things. "I wanted to ask you something before I go inside." She waited. Cole looked at his horse for a moment, then back at her. He did not appear to be searching for words so much as choosing them carefully, the way a man picks his steps across uncertain ground. When I was here last time, he said, I noticed you do most of the actual work in that post. That's not a question. No. A beat. Are you spoken for? The directness of it landed like something dropped. Not cruel, just blunt, the way practical people were blunt when they decided that circling around a thing only wasted time. Ruth looked at him. The cold air moved between them and the horses stamped in blue vapor, and behind the post the wood fire she'd been working toward crackled against the chill. No, she said. I didn't think so. He said it without satisfaction, just acknowledgement. I've been thinking, up on the range. I'm 31 years old. I've got a claim on 200 acres in the North Valley. I've got a cabin that needs work, but it's sound. I've got enough put by to get started properly. He looked at her steadily. I need a partner, someone who can work, someone I can talk straight with. Ruth's heart was doing something strange that she was trying not to pay attention to. You don't know me, Mr. Brennan. I know you can read a supply list and spot a repaired trap pan, and you don't fill silence with noise. He said it simply. I know you've been keeping this post running mostly by yourself. I know you gave me correct change without a second count. A slight pause. That's more than I know about most people. She stared at him. I'm not asking you to decide today, he said. I'm going to be in Harlan's Crossing for 4 or 5 days, restocking and getting some repairs done on my gear. If you want to talk, really talk, I'm at Parsons' boarding house. He gathered his reins. I just wanted to ask before I walked inside and your mother started planning a wedding between me and your sister. It was such an unexpected thing to say that Ruth almost laughed. Almost. She does tend to plan ahead, Ruth said. Something crossed his face. Not quite a smile, but in the neighborhood of one. I noticed that. He nodded toward the post. Shall we go in? In a minute. She bent down and picked up the axe. She had half a cord still to split. I've got work to finish. Cole looked at the pile of unsplit logs. Looked at her. Then he tied his horses to the post and picked up the second axe that was leaning against the wood pile. I've got time, he said. They split wood for 20 minutes before going inside, working in the same rhythm without discussing it. And that, more than anything else, was what Ruth turned over in her mind later that night, while the rest of the house slept, and she sat with the bad ledger numbers, and thought about what a person did when an impossible thing arrived looking like a practical proposal. Eleanor's reaction to learning that Cole Brennan had spoken to Ruth first was not quiet. Ruth had told her that evening after supper in the kitchen, while Vivian sat at the table listening with her hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee and an expression that Ruth couldn't entirely read. He spoke to you, Eleanor said. Not to me. Not to... He came to you. He came to resupply, Ruth said. He also asked if I was spoken for, because you were the first person he saw. Eleanor's voice was managing to be both controlled and clearly not controlled. Because you were out in the yard with an axe. Because he wanted to ask, Ruth said. Ruth. Eleanor sat down heavily at the kitchen table. Listen to me carefully. This family needs... I know what this family needs. Vivian is the one who should be... Eleanor stopped herself, started again. I'm not saying you're not valuable. I'm saying that a man like Cole Brennan is going to want... What? Ruth asked. The word came out quiet and flat, and Eleanor stopped again. What is he going to want that I can't provide? The silence in the kitchen was awful. Vivian set down her coffee cup. Mama, she said. I'm just being honest, Eleanor said, but her voice had lost some of its certainty. I know, Vivian said, but maybe stop. Eleanor looked at her younger daughter, then at her older one. Ruth's face was doing the thing it did when she was hurt and covering it. Very still, jaw set, eyes somewhere neutral. Eleanor had seen that face for 20 years, and it had never once moved her to do the right thing, and she knew it, which was perhaps why she looked away first. I only want what's best for this family, Eleanor said, to the table. I know, Ruth said. So do I. She stood up from her chair. He said he wants to talk, just talk. I'm going to talk to him. And if something comes of it, then something comes of it. Ruth took her coat from the hook by the door. And if Vivian finds her own good match, that will be wonderful. Those two things can both be true at the same time. She went out into the cold, and the door closed behind her, and Eleanor and Vivian sat in the kitchen in silence. "She's going to say yes," Vivian said after a while. Eleanor put her face in her hands. "Good," Vivian said quietly. "She deserves something that's hers." She went to Parsons' boarding house the following afternoon, at a time when the post was quiet and Vivian could manage without her. She told her mother she was going to check on the delivery schedule with the freight man. This was not entirely untrue. The freight man's office was on the same street. Cole was on the porch of the boarding house when she arrived, a mug of something steaming in his hand, looking out at the gray November sky with the patience of a man accustomed to waiting on weather. He saw her coming and said nothing until she'd come up the steps and stood near the railing. Then he said, "I didn't know if you'd come." "I said I'd think about it," she said. I thought about it. And I have questions." He gestured to the chair beside him. She sat. He sat. Across the street, two men were loading a wagon with supplies for the winter, working in the unhurried way of people doing familiar things. "Ask," he said. So she did. She asked about the cabin, how far from Harlan's Crossing, how it was built, what needed to be done to it. He answered in specific terms. 11 miles up the North Valley Trail, timber construction, sound walls, and a leaking chimney, and a floor that needed new boards in the back quarter. He had a root cellar that held. He had a spring that ran year-round. He had no barn yet, just a lean-to, which was a problem that would need to be solved before the next winter. She asked about the trapping, the income, the seasons, the years when it was good and the years when it wasn't. He was honest about the years when it wasn't. 1856 had been bad. The fur prices dropped, and he'd had to supplement by hiring out to a freighting company for 3 months, which he hadn't minded but wouldn't want to do every year. She asked about why he wasn't married. He thought about that one. "I've been asked before," he said. "Once, seriously. A woman in Billings. She was a good woman. She wanted a particular kind of life, though, a settled life, a town life, neighbors close by, and social evenings." He looked at the gray sky. "I knew I couldn't give her that without becoming someone I didn't want to be. So it didn't work out." A pause. "I'm not easy to live with, Miss Mercer. I want you to know that before anything else. I'm quiet when I'm thinking, which is most of the time. I work strange hours. I've got opinions I'll argue for too long." "So do I," she said. He looked at her. "I know. How do you know? You've spent maybe 3 hours in my company." "Because you've been arguing silently with your mother for years about whether you're worth choosing," he said, "and you haven't quit yet." The directness of that hit her somewhere she hadn't expected. She looked at the street for a moment. "That's presumptuous," she said. "Yes," he agreed. "I'm sorry, but I'm right." She was quiet for a while. Below them, the men finished loading the wagon and drove away. "What would you need from me?" she asked. "Practically speaking, what does the arrangement look like?" "Honest answer," he said. I only want honest answers. I need someone who can hold down the homestead when I'm on the range. That means knowing when to fix something yourself and when to get help. It means managing food stores and keeping accounts and making decisions without waiting for me to come home and make them. He turned his cup in his hands. It means months, where it's just you and the weather and the work, and you have to be someone who can live inside that without going hollow. She thought about 5 years of running a trading post with a bent pen nib and a ledger that never balanced, and no one who noticed the work because the work was just expected. "I can live inside that," she said. He nodded slowly, like something had been confirmed. "What do you need from me?" he asked. And the question surprised her. Not that he asked it, but that he waited for the answer the way he'd waited for the weather. She thought about it seriously. "I need to not be invisible," she said. "I need to matter to the person I'm with, not to be praised or fussed over, just—" She searched for the word. "Counted. I need to be counted." Something in his expression shifted, settled. "I can do that," he said. They talked for another hour. Not romantic talk. Nothing that would have satisfied Eleanor's notions of how these things were supposed to go. They talked about water rights and livestock and what she knew about preserving food for winter and what he knew about the trails between the North Valley and Harlan's Crossing. They talked about money, directly and without embarrassment, which was unusual and felt, to Ruth, like a relief she hadn't known to expect. When she stood to leave, he stood too. I'm going to be here through Thursday, he said. If you want more time to decide, I'll let you know by Wednesday, she said. She went home the long way, past the freight office and around the south end of town, and she walked slowly because she wanted to think without the post around her. The wind had a smell in it now, like real winter coming, not just the warning of it, the kind of cold that meant business. She thought about the ledger. She thought about her mother's face when she'd said, I only want what's best for this family. She thought about Vivian's voice saying she deserves something that's hers. She thought about a man on a porch asking what she needed from him and waiting for the answer. By the time she got back to the post, she'd made her decision. She didn't tell anyone that night. She sat with it quietly, the way she sat with most things, and she let it settle into her bones, and she thought, well, all right then. Word got around Harlan's Crossing the way words always did, quickly, inaccurately, and with genuine enthusiasm. By Tuesday morning, 3 people had mentioned it to Ruth in passing at the post. By Tuesday afternoon, Hester Odom, who ran the dry goods store on the East End and had an opinion about everything, came in specifically to buy a 10-cent spool of thread and mention, as if incidentally, that she'd heard Cole Brennan had been asking about the Mercer girls. Asking about me? Ruth said, handing her the thread. Hester's eyebrows did something complicated. Well, yes. A pause. I don't mean anything by it, Ruth. Cole Brennan's a good man. I'd hate to see anyone. I mean, you know how men are. Sometimes they think they want one thing, and then... Hester, Ruth said pleasantly, your thread. Hester took it and left. The man who ran the grain supply, Willis, said something to Cole directly. Ruth heard about this secondhand from the freight man's wife, who had heard it from Willis's son. Willis had apparently said something to the effect of wondering if Cole had gotten a good look at Ruth's scar, the implication being that perhaps he hadn't fully seen what he was getting into. Cole had apparently said, according to the freight man's wife, I see fine, and changed the subject. When Ruth heard this, she felt something she couldn't quite categorize. Gratitude, partly, but also something harder, something that had to do with 26 years of being looked at with that particular expression Willis wore when he thought he was being helpful. The expression of someone lowering their expectations on your behalf. She went to the boarding house on Wednesday morning, earlier than she'd said. Cole was at the table in the common room eating breakfast when she came in, and he looked up and said nothing, which she appreciated. Yes, she said. He set down his fork, looked at her. All right, he said. That was the whole conversation. Afterward, she thought there should have been more words, or different words, or something that marked the moment as significant. But she'd never been good at performing significance. She said yes, and he said all right, and outside the wind was picking up from the north, and they had practical things to figure out. They sat down and started figuring. Eleanor didn't speak to Ruth for 2 full days. This was not the longest silence between them. There had been a 3-day one when Ruth was 19 over the matter of the feed supplier's accounts, but it was the most weighted. Eleanor moved through the post with a deliberate distance, present and pointedly not present at the same time, serving customers and organizing shelves and cooking meals without once addressing Ruth directly. Ruth found this exhausting but not unbearable. She'd had practice. Vivian, unexpectedly, was the one who came to her room the second night and sat on the edge of her bed and said, "Are you scared?" Ruth was sitting at her small desk, working through a list of what she'd need to bring and what she'd need to leave. She set her pen down. "Yes," she said. "Of him?" "No, of..." She stopped, started again. "Of being wrong, of choosing something and finding out I misread it." Vivian pulled her knees up to her chest, young and suddenly uncertain in a way she usually wasn't. "What if you misread him? Then I figure out how to manage it." "That's not an answer." "It's the only answer I've got." Ruth looked at her list. "I've been wrong about things before. I'll be wrong about things again. That's not a good enough reason not to try." Vivian was quiet for a moment. "Mama's scared too, you know. She's not angry. She's scared." "I know. She thinks without you running the post..." "The post was in trouble before me, and it'll work out without me," Ruth said, with more confidence than she felt. "Mama's capable when she has to be. So is Frank Odom, if she'd agree to take on help." She looked at her sister. "And you're better at this than you let on." Vivian made a face. "Don't make me responsible for the ledger. You already know how to read the ledger. You just pretend you don't, so Mama doesn't expect it. Ruth said it without judgment. Start expecting it from yourself. They sat together in the small room for a while, the two of them, the older sister and the younger, with the night sounds of Harlan's Crossing coming through the walls. A dog somewhere, the creak of the building in the wind, the distant low moan of weather moving through the mountains. He really did just choose you, Vivian said eventually. Not because of anything Mama planned, just chose you. Yes. Does that feel strange? Ruth thought about it, about the man splitting wood with her without being asked, about him asking what she needed from him and then waiting. It feels like something I don't have a word for yet, she said. Vivian nodded, as if that made sense. Then she unfolded herself and went to the door. I hope it works, she said. I genuinely hope it works. Thank you, Vivian. Don't thank me. Just right when you get there. She paused in the doorway. Tell me if the mountains are as big as they look from the road. They're bigger, Ruth said, though she didn't know yet. It felt true anyway. The door closed and Ruth went back to her list, and outside the wind kept coming down from the north with all the force of the season behind it, and somewhere 11 miles up the trail, on 200 acres of North Valley land, there was a cabin with a leaking chimney and a good spring. And her whole impossible, unexpected future was beginning, whether she was ready for it or not. She wrote until the lamp needed oil. Then she refilled it and wrote some more. The wedding happened on a Thursday. Not because Thursday was special, but because Cole needed to be back on the range before the next weather system moved through. And the circuit preacher who came through Harlan's Crossing did his rounds on Wednesdays and Thursdays, and Ruth had decided that if she was going to do this, she was going to do it properly and not elope like she was ashamed of herself. So Thursday it was, in the small clapboard building at the north end of town that served as a meeting hall, and on days when the preacher came through, a place of worship. Eleanor came. Ruth had expected she might refuse or make a scene, or arrive with a specific expression designed to communicate suffering without actually saying anything that could be quoted back to her. She did arrive with that expression, but she also arrived, which Ruth counted as something. Vivian stood beside Ruth during the ceremony, close enough that their sleeves touched. She didn't say anything sentimental, which Ruth appreciated. When the preacher got to the part about the exchange of vows, Vivian reached over and briefly squeezed Ruth's hand once, hard, and then let go. That was enough. Cole wore a clean shirt and his better coat, the one without the patched elbow. He had trimmed his beard, not to neatness exactly, but to something more intentional. He stood straight and answered his parts of the ceremony in a clear voice without looking at the ceiling or his boots, which Ruth had observed was more than a lot of men managed. When it was done, Cole shook the preacher's hand, and Eleanor kissed Ruth on the cheek with a stiffness that communicated a great deal of complicated feeling in a very small gesture. And Vivian said, "Well, that's that," in a tone that could have been sad or relieved, or both. The settlement turned out in the way small communities turn out for events. Not with celebration exactly, but with presence. People stood outside the hall in the cold, neighbors and regulars from the post, and a few faces Ruth barely knew, watching with the particular avid attention of people who sense they are witnessing something that will be discussed for years. She heard Willis from the grain supply say something to the man beside him, too low to catch the words. But she saw the other man's expression and had a fair idea of the content. She didn't look at Willis. She took Cole's arm when he offered it, and they walked to where the horses were tied, and that was that. They left Harlan's Crossing 2 hours later before noon, while the light was still good and the trail was readable. Ruth had 1 trunk and 2 saddlebags. She'd spent 3 evenings deciding what to take and had ended up leaving more than she'd brought, partly from practical necessity. Cole's pack horses could only carry so much. And partly because she'd realized, somewhere in the 3rd evening of sorting, that most of what she owned was tied up in the post itself. The tools she'd used every day. The ledger she'd kept. The knowledge of where everything was stored. What she actually owned, separate from the post, fit into 1 trunk and 2 saddlebags. She didn't find that depressing exactly. It was just a fact, clear as the number columns she'd spent 5 years tallying. She packed what she had and left the rest. The last thing she did before mounting her horse was go back into the post alone, through the front door that always rattled its bell, and stand in the middle of the main room for a moment. The floor she knew by sound, the shelves she'd organized and reorganized, the counter where she'd spent more hours than she could count with a pen and a ledger and a lamp. the west-facing window that caught the afternoon light at a useful angle. She stood there for maybe a minute. Didn't say anything, because there was no one to say anything to, and she wasn't the kind of person who talked to rooms. She just let herself look at it, the whole of it, and then she turned around and walked out and got on her horse. Cole was waiting on the road. He looked at her when she came through the door but didn't ask. She was grateful for that too. They rode north. The trail out of Harlan's Crossing climbed steadily through stands of lodgepole pine, the trees close enough together that the wind dropped as soon as you entered them, replaced by a silence that had its own quality, not empty, but full of different sounds, the creak and settle of branches, the occasional sharp crack of something in the cold. Once, a raven called from somewhere high up, 3 notes, decisive, and was answered by nothing. Ruth had ridden this trail before, in summer, going no more than 3 or 4 miles to collect herbs that grew along the upper creek. She'd never gone further than that. After about an hour of riding, the terrain she knew gave way to terrain she didn't, and she found herself paying attention in a different way, reading the trail the way you read unfamiliar handwriting, slower and more carefully, making sure you didn't miss anything. Cole rode slightly ahead where the trail narrowed, and she watched how he moved through the landscape. He didn't talk much, but he wasn't closed off. Every now and then he'd half turn and say something practical. Stream crossing in about a mile, the footing soft on the east bank. Or, that stand of firs on the left is where the trail forks. We take the right branch. Information offered not as conversation, but as a kind of courtesy, orienting her to a landscape he knew well, and she didn't. She asked him, after about 2 hours of riding, "How did you find this land in the first place?" He considered that. Followed a creek up one spring, looking for sign. Came over a ridge, and the valley was just there below me. Good water, good timber, sheltered from the north wind by the ridge. I came back with enough money to file the claim the following spring. How long ago? Long. 4 years. I've been building it up in between trapping seasons. He glanced back. It's not finished. I want to say that plainly. It's not a finished place. You told me that. I want to make sure you heard it. Cole, she said, and he turned further to look at her. I grew up in a trading post that smelled like old leather and wasn't making its accounts. I know what unfinished looks like. Something in his jaw relaxed, just slightly. All right, tell me about the cabin, she said. The actual structure, not just the chimney. So he told her. One main room, roughly 20 by 20, with a loft for sleeping reached by a fixed ladder. A small attached room on the south side that had been intended as a pantry but was currently used for equipment storage and would need to be properly fitted out. One window on the east wall, one on the south. The floor was whipsawn timber, solid except for the back quarter where moisture had gotten under and one board had warped significantly and 2 more were soft. The soft boards need to come out, Ruth said. They do. Before or after the chimney? I'd say chimney first. You can't work on the floor comfortably if the smoke doesn't draw right. What's wrong with the chimney? The clay pointing between the stones is cracked, needs to be picked out and redone. It's not a complicated job, it's just cold work this time of year. Ruth thought about cold work and said, I can do pointing work. Cole looked at her. My father taught me, she said. We repointed the trading post chimney when I was 14, both of us on the roof in October. She remembered that clearly. Her father on his hands and knees in the frost, patient as always, showing her how to pack the clay in properly, tamping it with his thumb. He'd been a man who taught things by doing them alongside you, not by explaining them from a distance. She'd learned more from him on that cold roof than in most other places. It's not complicated work, she said. Just careful work. Yes, Cole said. That's exactly right. They rode on. The light was starting to think about declining. Not dark yet, not close to it, but with that late afternoon flatness that came with short days. Ruth pulled her coat tighter and watched the trail and thought about chimney pointing and warped floorboards, and what it meant that she was thinking about chimney pointing and warped floorboards with something that felt strangely like engagement rather than dread. The valley appeared below them without warning, the way Cole had described it appearing to him. You came over a ridge and then it was simply there. Wider than she'd imagined, the creek running dark through the center of it, ice forming at the edges where the current slowed. The timber came down close on the north side but pulled back on the south to leave a cleared area. And in that cleared area, small from this distance but getting larger as they descended, was the cabin. It was rougher than she'd pictured, which was saying something because she'd pictured it rough. The walls were solid. She could see that even from here, good timber, properly chinked. But the lean-to that served as the barn was a leaning structure of poles and canvas that had clearly had a difficult season, and the yard around the cabin had the disheveled look of a place managed by someone who was often away. There were things that had been left where they'd been used and not put back. A snow-dusted coil of rope near the door. What looked like a harness draped over the fence rail of the small corral. A stack of wood that had partially fallen and not been restacked. Cole pulled up his horse at the edge of the yard and looked at it without speaking for a moment. Then he said, "I know. I didn't say anything." "You were about to." Ruth looked at the coil of rope in the snow. "I was going to ask where you want me to put my trunk." Cole was quiet for a beat. Then he dismounted. "Loft," he said. "I'll sleep in the main room until we get the loft arranged properly for two. There's a cot." "That's not—" "It's what makes sense for now," he said, leading his horse toward the corral. "We'll figure out the rest as we go." She stayed on her horse for a moment, looking at the cabin in the flat late light, at the frozen creek and the dark timber and the enormous pale sky above it all. 11 miles from Harlan's Crossing, a world away from the post. Then she dismounted and started unpacking. They worked until dark without much talk, which turned out to be the shape of most evenings with Cole, purposeful and quiet. He saw to the horses with the focused attention he gave all his animals, making sure they were watered and fed and properly sheltered in the lean-to before he thought about anything else. Ruth explored the cabin systematically, opening the pantry room and taking inventory of what was stored there, checking the main room for what was present and what was missing. She found a cast iron stove that was functional but needed cleaning, a table and 2 chairs that didn't match, a shelf of basic supplies, a collection of tools hanging on the wall in a more organized fashion than the yard had suggested, and on a wooden peg near the door, a single woman's coat that had belonged to someone else, left there and apparently forgotten. She left it where it was. Cole came in when the animals were settled and built up the fire in the stove without being asked, and Ruth found the pot and the dried beans she'd spotted in the pantry and started something for supper, and they moved around each other in the small space with a careful courtesy that was not quite comfortable but was not tense either, like 2 people who'd agreed to share a table on a long train journey and were working out the early etiquette of proximity. Supper was beans and hard bread and dried meat, and they ate it at the mismatched table in the light of a single lamp, and Cole said, "Tomorrow I want to start on the chimney, if the weather holds." "I'll need to see the mortar you have," Ruth said. "There's a bag of lime in the pantry. I've got clay along the creek bank. We'll need to mix it inside or it'll freeze before we can use it." He nodded, thinking about that. "Stove in here is hot enough to keep a small batch workable." "Then we mix small and work fast," she said. He looked at her across the table. The lamp made his face warmer than the firelight outside had, and he looked tired in a way that wasn't alarming, just the ordinary tiredness of a man who'd been working hard in cold country. "You're not—" He stopped. "Not what?" "I was going to say you're not what I expected," he said, "but I'm not sure what I expected." Ruth wrapped both hands around her tin cup. "Were you worried?" He was quiet for a moment, honest enough not to immediately say no. "Some," he said. "About what specifically?" "About whether this was—" He turned his cup in his hands, the way he'd done on the boarding house porch. "Whether I'd done something selfish, pulled someone away from their life because I needed something." Ruth looked at him. "My life back there was a ledger that didn't balance, and a mother who kept not quite saying I wasn't enough." She said it evenly, without self-pity, just the way you state a fact that's been true long enough to stop hurting the way it used to. "This is hard and cold, and that chimney is going to be miserable to fix. But this is mine. Whatever happens here, I'm part of it." She paused. "That's not nothing." Cole was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "No, it's not." They cleaned up after supper in the same comfortable quiet, and Cole took his cot by the stove, and Ruth climbed the ladder to the loft, where she'd arranged her things in the space that was now hers. The loft was low-ceilinged and drafty at the one end where the chinking needed attention, and she could hear the wind in the timber outside and the sound of the creek if she listened for it under everything else. The straw mattress was not comfortable. She lay on it and looked at the rough ceiling and felt the strangeness of the whole day settling over her. The ceremony, the ride, the valley appearing from the ridge, this loft, this life. She didn't sleep right away. That was fine. She lay there and listened to the wind and thought about the chimney, and eventually the warmth from the stove below made its way up through the boards, and the strangeness became something more like ordinary, and she slept. She woke at first light when Cole got up, because the cabin was small enough that you could hear everything, and lay still for a moment listening to him build up the fire and move quietly in the main room below. Not trying to be quiet exactly, but calibrated to morning, not crashing around, just moving at the pace of someone who'd spent a lot of mornings alone and had developed a relationship with early hours. She got up. She came down the ladder. Cole looked up from where he was crouching by the stove and said, "Coffee's on," which was not a greeting but functioned as one. "Thank you," she said, and that was the morning. They worked on the chimney that day and most of the next. It was exactly as miserable as the cold promised, standing on the roof with lime clay in a bucket trying to pack it into cracked joints before it stiffened in the air. Ruth worked the lower joints while Cole worked the upper ones where the lean was worse, and they handed the bucket back and forth and said practical things to each other. "That section there, use your thumb, not the spatula, let me get more mix." And by the end of the second day, the chimney drew cleanly, and the smoke went where it was supposed to go, and they stood in the yard in the last of the light and watched it with the flat satisfaction of people who had fixed a thing that needed fixing. Cole said, "The back left corner still needs a course of pointing in spring." "I can see that from here," Ruth said. "You have a good eye." "I have a cold eye," she said. "Can we go inside?" He almost laughed. Almost. She was learning what that almost looked like. The way the lines around his eyes shifted, the slight compression at the corner of his mouth. He was not a man who laughed easily, but the almost was genuine, which she decided was more honest than easy laughter anyway. Inside, with the stove running properly and the smoke going up instead of sideways into the room, the cabin felt different, warmer in a more settled way, less provisional. Ruth stood near the stove and felt heat moving through her hands, and thought about the warped floorboards, and the pantry that needed fitting out, and the lean-to that would not survive another full winter without serious work. The list was long. She was not distressed by this. It was a list she could hold in her head and work through systematically, which was more than she'd been able to say about the Trading Post ledger in its final months. She thought about what she'd said to Cole at the table on their first evening. "This is mine. Whatever happens here, I'm part of it." She still believed it, more than she had when she'd said it, actually, because saying it in the abstract was one thing, and standing in a repaired cabin on her second day in a North Montana valley with clay on her hands and her own exhaustion in her bones was another thing entirely. More specific, more real, not easy. She wasn't going to tell herself it was easy because she'd spent 26 years being honest with herself about hard things, and she wasn't going to stop now. It was hard. The isolation was real, and the work was relentless, and she'd found herself in the middle of the second night of chimney work thinking about the Trading Post with a sudden fierce homesickness that startled her. Not for her mother or even for Vivian exactly, but for the familiarity of knowing a place down to its bones, knowing where everything was, knowing the sound of the floorboard by the door. She didn't have that here. Not yet. The cabin was still a stranger's space shaped around a stranger's habits, and she was working her way into it like a key being slowly fitted to a lock, finding the places that didn't quite match yet, adjusting, trying again. Cole came in from checking on the horses and hung his coat by the door and stood near the stove, and they were both quiet for a while. Not the uncomfortable quiet of two people who don't know what to say, but the quieter quiet of two people who don't need to fill the space. It was, Ruth thought, one of the things she'd been right about him. He could sit inside silence without flinching. That was rarer than people knew. "Willis came to see me before we left," Cole said after a while. "At the boarding house." Ruth looked at him. "I heard." "You heard what he said?" "Enough of it." Cole was looking at the stove. "I want you to know that it didn't change anything, in case you were wondering." "I wasn't wondering," she said. And then because it was true, and she thought he should know it. "But I'm glad you said so." He nodded. They stood by the stove, and outside the wind moved through the valley with its steady northern voice. and the fire in the stove was good and even, and the chimney drew clean, and that was the second night of their marriage. Ordinary and imperfect and enough, the way most real things were. December came down hard. Ruth had grown up in Montana and understood winter in the theoretical way of someone who had always been able to step inside and warm her hands by a stove that someone else had kept fed. She'd known cold. She had not known this cold. The specific quality of cold in a valley, 11 miles from the nearest settlement, where the wind came off the ridge without anything to slow it, and the temperature dropped at night to places the thermometer on the cabin's south wall seemed reluctant to confirm. The first week of December, she spent learning the rhythm of the homestead in winter, the way you learned a new language, by immersion, by mistake, by the slow accumulation of small competencies. She learned that the water bucket left too close to the door would freeze solid by morning and needed to sit within arm's reach of the stove. She learned that the horses needed breaking ice from their water trough twice a day, not once, when the temperature stayed below a certain point. She learned that the lean-to, which she'd assessed on arrival as inadequate, was in fact critically inadequate, and that the two horses spent the coldest night shivering in a way that made Cole's jaw tight and sent him out before first light with extra blankets and a dark expression. "The barn," he said one morning over coffee, looking at the lean-to through the south window. "Spring, first thing. Before the floor? Before everything." He set his cup down. "I can't have the animals go through another winter like this." She appreciated that about him, the ordering of his priorities. The horses came before his own comfort, and his own comfort came before aesthetics, and aesthetics came a distant last to everything functional. It was a sensible hierarchy for a man in his circumstances, and she found it easier to work alongside than the reverse would have been. Cole left for the North Range on the 10th of December. He told her he would need to go back up. He had traps still set from the fall, trap lines that needed to be checked and reset or pulled depending on conditions, and leaving them unattended through the deep of winter was not something a careful trapper did. He told her this before they were married, during their conversation on the boarding house porch, laid out as plainly as the information about the leaking chimney and the warped floor. She had understood it then as a fact. She understood it differently on the morning he actually rode out. He'd spent 2 days before leaving making sure the firewood was stacked high and accessible, the horse feed accounted for, the food stores organized in the pantry the way she'd set them up, methodical, labeled, arranged by what would run out first. He checked the stove and the repaired chimney. He checked the latch on the cabin door. He was not fussing exactly. He did these things with the same efficiency he did everything. But she could see in the repetition of them that he was working through a mental list of all the things that could go wrong while he was away, and doing what he could about each of them in advance. The morning he left, she stood in the doorway of the cabin and watched him load his pack horse, and she felt something she didn't have a precise name for. Not fear, not exactly. Something more like the feeling of standing on a riverbank after someone's crossed to the other side and the ferry's gone. Not stranded, but aware of the specific shape of your aloneness. Cole mounted his horse and looked back at her. "Probably 3 weeks," he said. "Maybe 4 if the weather closes in." "I know. If something goes wrong with the horses, I'll manage." He looked at her for a moment. She met it directly. "Ruth," he said. "Cole." A beat. Something in his expression that she was still learning to read, not quite concern, not quite apology, something that had elements of both, and was also something else. "I'll be back before Christmas if I can. Don't rush the trail on my account," she said. "I'd rather you came back late and sound than fast and half frozen." He held her gaze for another moment, then nodded once and turned his horse north and rode away through the lodgepole pines, and the sound of the hooves faded into the silence of the valley, and Ruth stood in the doorway until the cold pushed her back inside. The first 3 days alone were the hardest in the particular way that new things were hard. Not because the work was beyond her, but because she hadn't settled into the rhythm of it yet, and every task required conscious thought instead of habit. She broke ice from the trough and fed the horses and cut wood from the stack, and kept the stove fed and cooked for herself, and kept the cabin in order. And none of it was beyond her competence, but all of it took the focused attention of unfamiliarity, which was more tiring than competence alone. On the 4th day, she woke to 2 feet of new snow. She lay in the loft for a moment, listening to the weight of it on the roof, and then she dressed in every layer she had, and went down and built up the fire, and then put on her coat and went outside to deal with it. The snow had drifted against the lean-to, pushing the canvas wall inward. The horses were pressed together at the back, both of them looking at her with the mute reproach of animals who have opinions about their accommodations. She spent an hour clearing the drift and bracing the canvas back with a pole she found in the equipment room, working with her hands getting clumsy in her gloves, breath coming in hard clouds. When she got back inside, she stood by the stove for 10 minutes, just letting her hands come back to feeling before she could do anything else. She wrote to Vivian that evening. She'd promised she would, and she kept the promises she made, and also there was something about the silence of the valley and snow that made her want to put words somewhere outside her own head. She wrote about the snow and the horses and the repaired chimney and the way the valley looked in the early morning when the light came over the ridge and hit everything at once. She did not write about being lonely because she wasn't sure lonely was the right word. She was alone, which was different. Alone was a condition. Lonely was a want. She could feel the aloneness clearly, like a physical thing, the shape of another person's absence in the rooms and mornings and mealtimes. But she wasn't falling apart from it, which surprised her a little. She'd wondered if she would. She wrote, "The mountains are bigger than they look from the road. You were right to ask." She wrote, "I think I made the right choice. I'm not saying it's easy. I'm saying it feels like mine." She folded the letter and set it on the table to go to Harlan's Crossing when she next had reason to go, and then she went to bed in the loft and listened to the valley and slept. Cole came back on the 21st of December, 4 days before she'd expected him, and she was in the yard splitting wood when she heard the horses on the trail. She set down the axe and waited. He came through the tree line with his pack horse loaded heavy with furs, and when he saw her in the yard, he raised a hand in a gesture that was not quite a wave, more like acknowledgement, the same way you'd acknowledge a landmark you'd been watching for. He looked thin, tired in a way that went past the ordinary end-of-day tired she'd come to recognize. His beard was a serious matter now, and there were lines around his eyes that the weeks on the range had deepened. "Good season?" she asked, the same question she'd asked him in October at the post. It felt like a longer time ago than it was. "Better than fair," he said, dismounting. "Prices are good in Billings. I'll make the trip after Christmas." "There's stew on the stove," she said. "It's been there since this morning. It'll be better for it." He looked at her over his horse's back with something that was not quite the almost laugh, but was in the same family. "You knew I was coming today?" "I knew you'd come when you could," she said, "and you're the kind of man who can." He took care of his horses before he ate. She'd known he would. And she ladled out the stew and cut bread and set the table. And when he finally came in and sat down and ate, he ate with the focused intensity of a man who'd been cold and working for 3 weeks and had not had a hot meal in some portion of that time. He didn't talk. She let him eat. When he was halfway through the bowl, he slowed down enough to be conscious of being at a table again, and he looked up and said, "How were the horses?" "Cold and judgmental," she said, "particularly the gray. That's just how he looks." "I know. I've made my peace with it." Cole almost smiled, the real version this time, the one that actually reached his eyes, brief and unguarded. Ruth noted it the way she noted important information. She didn't comment on it because commenting on it would have made him aware of it, and it was worth more unguarded than named. "The lean-to held?" he asked. "Mostly. There was a bad drift in early December that pushed the canvas. I braced it with a pole." He set down his spoon and looked at her. "You should have told me in the letter. There was nothing you could have done about it from the range." She met his look steadily. "I handled it. That's what we agreed." A pause. He picked up his spoon again. "You're right," he said, which was something she noticed he was willing to say when he was wrong, without working up to it or hedging around it. She'd noticed this in their 2 weeks together before he left, and it struck her again now. Some men could not say "you're right" to a woman without it costing them something they couldn't afford. Cole said it like a simple transaction, information exchanged, matter settled. "I wrote to Vivian," she said. "Good," she wrote back. Ruth got up and took the folded letter from the shelf where she'd put it. She held it out. He looked surprised, which she hadn't expected. "You can read it," she said. "There's nothing private." He took the letter and read it while he finished his stew. She watched him read. His lips didn't move and his expression didn't shift much. He read the way he did everything, with a focused attention that was neither performative nor casual. Near the end, something in his face did change, something around the eyes. He set the letter down on the table. "She's funny," he said. "She's always been funny. People underestimate her because she's pretty." "What does she say about the post?" Ruth sat back down. "Mama took on Frank Odom's boy for 2 days a week. Vivian's doing more of the accounts." She paused. "She says the November numbers were better." Cole looked at her. "The post was struggling," Ruth said. "I knew it, Mama knew it, but having me there wasn't saving it. It just meant there was someone to watch it fail slowly." She said it without drama. "Whatever Vivian's doing, she's doing it right. Maybe she needed the space." "Maybe you both did," Cole said. Ruth thought about that. About Vivian's hands around a coffee cup saying she deserves something that's hers. About Eleanor's face at the wedding, complicated and present. "Maybe," she said. Christmas was quiet. They had no tree and no particular ceremony around it, which suited them both. Ruth made a spiced pudding from dried fruit and suet she'd had the foresight to bring in her trunk, and Cole produced from somewhere in his pack a small tin of good tobacco and a folded piece of paper that turned out to be a hand-drawn map of the property's boundaries, marked with water sources and the best timber stands, with a notation at the top that said for Ruth in his cramped, practical hand. She looked at the map for a long time. "So you know the land," he said, "not just the cabin. The whole thing." She traced one of the creek lines with her finger. "How long did this take you?" "Evenings on the range?" A shrug. "I know it by memory. Putting it down wasn't hard." It was the most personal thing he'd given her, she thought. Not the most valuable in terms of money, but the most personal. This record of a place he'd spent 4 years learning, reproduced carefully on paper so she could learn it too. So she could know it the way he did. She folded it carefully and put it on the shelf above the table, where she could reach it. "Thank you," she said. "Useful," he said, which was his version of "you're welcome." January was when she began to understand the valley in a way that went past the practical. She'd been managing it since December, knowing it, working it, learning its moods the way you learned weather patterns, watching for what each shift in wind or cloud meant for the day ahead. But January was when she started to feel it, which was different. The way the light hit the ridge in the early morning, long and level and particular to that specific combination of terrain and season. The sound the creek made under the ice, a low, continuous murmur that meant the water was still running, and the winter hadn't closed it completely. The behavior of the jays in the trees on the north slope, she'd noticed they moved down toward the cabin before a serious storm, and she'd started paying attention to them the way she'd once paid attention to the trading post's accounts, looking for patterns, building prediction out of observation. She told Cole this one evening, describing the jays and their storm behavior, and he listened without interrupting and then said, "I've noticed that too. I assumed it was just me." "Why would it be just you?" "Because I spend a lot of time alone up there." He looked at the fire in the stove. "You start thinking everything you notice is just your own head." "But you write it down." She'd seen his notebooks. There were 3 of them on the shelf, worn covers, filled with his small, cramped writing. "I write down what I observe," he said. "Trail conditions, trap locations, weather patterns, animal behavior." A pause. "I don't usually show anyone." "Would you show me?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he got up and brought one of the notebooks to the table. He opened it to a page set, not the first page, somewhere in the middle, and set it in front of her. She read. The entries were dated and spare, the writing of a man who chose precision over eloquence. But underneath the spare language there was something that was not spare at all. An accumulation of careful attention to a particular piece of the world, building year over year into something that was almost a portrait of the North Range and its rhythms. He'd noted things she wouldn't have thought to look for. The dates when specific animals first appeared after winter, the way ice formed differently on the east-facing creeks versus the west-facing ones. A 3-line observation about a pack of wolves he'd tracked for 2 days without being able to say exactly why, ending with, "I wanted to know where they were going." They were going into the timber. Maybe that's all there was to it. Ruth read that last line twice. "You should write more," she said. It's just notes." "It's not just notes." She turned the page. "You're paying attention to things most people don't even look at." He was looking at the notebook with the expression of someone who'd been told something they weren't sure they believed. It's just useful to know, he said. Coal. She looked at him. Both things can be true. He closed the notebook and put it back on the shelf, but she noticed he did it differently than he'd taken it down. Less the putting away of a thing no one was supposed to see, more the returning of it to a place where it lived. February came, and with it, a cold snap that made December look mild in retrospect. The thermometer on the south wall dropped to readings that made practical tasks actively dangerous, and Ruth spent 5 days working primarily within 15 feet of the cabin, doing what needed doing quickly and coming inside to warm before going out again. She developed a system: coat on, task completed, coat off, hands to the stove, wait, repeat. That was tedious but functional, which she thought was an accurate description of most of what winter homesteading required. Cole was restless during the cold snap, the way working men got restless when weather pinned them indoors. He repaired harness and sharpened tools and spent a lot of time reading and considerably more time not reading while holding a book. Ruth let him be restless without trying to manage it, which she suspected was the right call based on observation. He didn't need to be fixed. He just needed to move through it. On the third day of being confined, he said abruptly from across the room where he was sitting with the unread book, "Tell me about your father." Ruth looked up from the mending she was doing. What about him? What he was like? She thought about it. She hadn't talked about her father in years, not because she'd been avoiding it, but because no one had asked. Quiet, she said, not cold quiet, a different kind. He was quiet because he was always thinking about something else, like part of his mind was in another room all the time. She turned the work in her hands. He was good at fixing things, patient about it. He'd take something apart that anyone else would throw away, and he'd work on it for a week if that's what it took, and at the end he'd have it running again, and he wouldn't make a thing of it. He'd just put it back where it came from. Sounds like he taught you that. He taught me to not give up on things that could still work, she said, which is different from not giving up on things in general. She paused. He knew the difference. He knew when something was genuinely done. He just didn't accept done until it was. Cole was quiet, looking at the book he wasn't reading. What about yours? She asked. She left when I was 9. He said it plainly, the way you said things that had been facts for long enough that the sharp edge had worn off them. My mother raised me and my brother. She was from Kentucky, came west with my father, and when he left, she just stayed. Because leaving twice seemed worse than staying once. He turned the book over in his hands. She worked. She always worked. I don't know what else to say about her. You don't need to say more than that. He set the book down on the table. Outside, the cold pressed against the cabin walls, and the fire in the stove worked against it steadily. Do you think about having children? He said, the way he asked difficult things. Not as an ambush, but as a direct question because he'd decided to ask and didn't see the point in circling. Ruth set down her mending. Yes, she said. You? Yes. They looked at each other across the small room, 2 adults in their 30s in a cabin in the middle of a Montana winter, being honest with each other, which was the hardest and most necessary thing. This is a hard place to raise children, she said. Most places are hard in different ways. That's true. She picked her mending back up. But I'm not saying no. I know, he said. I wasn't asking for a decision. I was asking what you think about. She considered that. I think about whether I'd do better than my mother. What did your mother do wrong? She decided what we were worth before we'd had a chance to show her. Ruth said it without particular anger. It was old territory, thoroughly mapped. She looked at Vivian and saw an asset. She looked at me and saw a liability. And she was working from what she knew, which was that the world treated pretty girls better than plain ones. She wasn't inventing that. She was just... Ruth paused, searching for the exact word. She was reacting to reality instead of trying to change it. Cole thought about that for a moment. And you would change it. I would try, she said. Whether I'd manage it, I don't know. I might turn into my mother in ways I can't see yet. That happens to people. It does, he agreed. Does it worry you? That you might turn into Eleanor? A beat. Some. Though I think the part of you that would fight against it is stronger than the part that might give in to it. It was the most direct observation about her character that he'd made. She held it for a moment, turned it over, decided it was accurate. "You're probably right," she said. "I know," he said, and there was something in it, not arrogance, just the easy certainty of someone who'd been paying attention, that made her almost smile. She went back to her mending. He went back to his book, and this time he actually read it. Outside, the cold pressed on, relentless and indifferent, and inside the stove worked steadily against it, and the two of them sat in their small cabin at the edge of the wilderness and were, imperfectly and genuinely, becoming something to each other that neither of them had a complete word for yet. That was February. March came in wet and complicated. The thaw started and then stalled, leaving everything in a state of half-resolved mud and ice that made the yard treacherous and the horses deeply unhappy. Ruth pulled her right knee doing something unglamorous, stepping wrong off the bottom porch step onto an ice patch she'd misjudged, and spent 3 days working at reduced capacity with the particular frustrated stoicism of someone who couldn't afford to not work, but also couldn't afford to make the injury worse. Cole, to his credit, did not try to sideline her. He said, "Tell me what you can't do." And she told him, and he redistributed the heavier outdoor tasks without ceremony and without making her feel managed. He also, on the second evening, sat across from her at the table and said, without preamble, "I should have put sand on that step in October. You didn't know I'd step wrong. I knew the step iced. I just didn't deal with it." He said it plainly, taking the responsibility without drama. "I'll do it properly when it thaws." "It's a step," she said. "It's not. It's ours," he said. "Things that are ours I deal with." She looked at him. At the careful plainness of his face in the lamplight, the honest tiredness of a man who worked hard and expected the same from himself as from anything else. "All right," she said. He sanded the step when the thaw allowed it. She watched him do it from the doorway. A careful, thorough job, the way he did all his careful, thorough jobs. Not quickly, not for show, just until it was right. It was a small thing. She knew it was a small thing. But it was the kind of small thing that told you what a person was made of more reliably than most large things ever did. And she stood in the doorway of their cabin in the muddy half-thawed March and watched her husband sand a step. And she thought, well, I was right about him. She was not right about everything. She knew that. There were fights coming that she couldn't see yet. Disagreements and hard seasons and all the ways two imperfect people sharing a small space in a difficult country would eventually find each other's edges. She wasn't innocent about that. But in the doorway in March, with the mud and the ice and the knee that was mostly better but still complained on cold mornings, she thought she'd been right about the essential thing. That counted for something. That counted for quite a lot. Spring arrived the way it always did in the North Valley. Not gently, not with any of the gradual warming that people in milder places associated with the season, but in fits and starts, 2 warm days followed by a hard frost, mud and ice taking turns at the yard until sometime in late April when the balance finally tipped and stayed tipped. The creek came up loud with snowmelt, running dark and fast for 3 weeks before settling back into itself, and the timber on the north slope went from bare gray to the particular yellow-green of new growth that looked almost too bright against the sky, like a color that hadn't quite calibrated to the surrounding landscape yet. Ruth spent April doing what she'd been thinking about all winter, the barn. Cole had the lumber delivered from Harlan's Crossing in 2 loads, hauled up the trail by the freightman's team in the brief window when the trail was thawed enough to be passable and dry enough not to be a disaster. The lumber arrived in the yard in a stack that Ruth walked around twice with her hands in her coat pockets, calculating dimensions and sequence in her head. Cole walked it with her on the second circuit, and they stood at the end of it and had their first real argument. It was about the foundation. Cole wanted to set the barn directly on packed earth with timber sill plates, which was faster and cheaper and perfectly standard for a structure of this type in this territory. Ruth wanted to set it on a course of dry stacked stone to keep the sill plates off the ground moisture, which would add 2 weeks to the build time and require hauling stone from the creek bank. "The sills will rot," she said. "We'll be rebuilding in 5 years." "Most barns in this territory are built exactly this way," he said. "They last 20 years. In drier ground. This yard holds water on the west side. You know it does. Look at the grass there. It's greener all spring." He looked at the west side of the yard. She was right about the grass, and he knew it. 2 weeks, he said. "That's 2 weeks I need for other things. 2 weeks now, or rebuild in 5 years. She held his gaze. You said you deal with things that are ours properly. This is how you do it properly. It was a direct use of his own words, and they both knew it. His jaw worked for a moment. The stone from the lower creek bank, he said finally. Not the upper. Upper bank's too loose. It'll take 3 times as long. Lower bank, she agreed. They hauled stone for 4 days. It was backbreaking work, loading flat creek stones into the wagon and driving them up to the barn site and wrestling them into a course that was level and stable enough to bear the weight of the structure above. Cole's back gave him trouble on the second day. An old injury, he'd said before, a fall from a scaffold 3 years ago that had left one side of his lower back unreliable under sustained load. He didn't stop. He adjusted how he lifted and he kept going, which Ruth watched and said nothing about because she understood the pride involved and because he was being sensible enough about the adjustment that she didn't need to intervene. On the 4th day, with the stone course finished and both of them aching in ways they didn't fully discuss, Cole stood back and looked at the foundation and said, "You were right." "I know," she said. "So were you about the lower bank. The upper would have killed us." He looked at her sideways. "We compromised." "We argued and then we compromised," she said. "That's different. Is it better?" She thought about it seriously, which was the only way she thought about things. "Yes," she said. "It means both of us looked at it hard. Neither of us just gave in." He nodded, slowly, like he was filing that away. "My father, what I remember of my father, he just decided things. My mother either agreed or she didn't say anything." He looked at the stone course. "I always thought that was how it worked." "For a lot of people it is," Ruth said. "Not for you. Not for me." She picked up her work gloves from where she'd left them on the wagon wheel. "I'm not easy, Cole. I told you that before. I have opinions about foundations." "You do," he agreed. There it was again, the almost smile, a little more frequent now than it had been in December. Progress, she thought. Slow and genuine and therefore worth something. "I'm starting to think that's not entirely a problem." "Starting to think," she said. "Give me time." They built the barn through May. It was the hardest sustained work Ruth had done in her life, and she'd done hard work. Framing and raising and roofing. Cole knew the technique and she learned it alongside him, not apprentice to master, but 2 people who had complementary knowledge and different physical capacities, and worked out the division of labor practically as they went. Cole did the heavy lifting where his height and upper body strength made it more efficient. Ruth did the detailed fitting work, cutting the mortise joints, shimming the door frame square, fitting the roof boards tight, where her patience and precision made it more accurate. When it was done, in the last week of May, they stood in the completed structure, and the horses walked in and stood in their proper stalls, and it smelled like new lumber and clean straw, and Cole put his hand flat on the wall and pressed it like he was checking that the thing was real. "It's good," he said. "It's solid," she agreed. Stone foundation and all. Vivian came to visit in June. She arrived with the freight man's second delivery of the month, having ridden up from Harlan's Crossing in the wagon with more luggage than Ruth had brought when she moved, which was saying something about Vivian's relationship with personal comfort. She stepped down from the wagon and looked at the homestead. The new barn, the cabin with its repaired chimney, the garden Ruth had started along the south wall, and said, "It's smaller than I thought." "It's 11 miles from town," Ruth said. "I know where it is." But Vivian was looking at everything with genuine attention, not the polite attention of someone doing their social duty. "The barn is new. We built it in May. You built it. Cole and I built it." Ruth took one of Vivian's bags. "Come inside." Vivian stayed for 5 days. She and Cole were careful with each other in the way of 2 people who shared an important person in common and were figuring out what they were to each other on their own account. Cole was polite in the slightly formal way he was polite to anyone he didn't know well. Vivian was Vivian, which meant she was warm and observant and entirely capable of reading a room. And by the second day, she'd figured out how Cole operated and stopped trying to fill his silences, and things became easier between them. On the 3rd evening, Cole was out doing the last check on the horses before dark, and Vivian sat at the table with Ruth and said, without preamble, He looks at you like you're the most reliable thing he's ever found. Ruth was slicing bread. That might be the most romantically underwhelming compliment I've ever received. I don't mean it that way. Vivian turned her coffee cup in her hands. The same gesture, Ruth noticed, that Cole used with his cup, though they'd never seen each other do it. I mean, he trusts you, actually trusts you, not the way men trust their dogs or their horses, the way people trust something they've checked and rechecked and found sound. She paused. Mama trusted no one and nothing. I don't think she ever has. She trusted the idea of a good match, Ruth said. She trusted that enough to build her whole plan on it. That's not the same thing. No, Ruth agreed. It's not. Vivian was quiet for a moment, then, she asks about you. Every week she asks if I've heard from you. She doesn't say she misses you. She just asks. Ruth set down the bread knife. I know what she means by it. I know you do. Vivian looked at her. You could write to her. I have written to her. She doesn't write back. She's working up to it. Vivian said it with the certainty of someone who had watched Eleanor Mercer work up to things before. She doesn't know how to say she was wrong about something without saying it, and she can't say it, so she has to find another way around to it. She'll get there. Ruth picked up the bread knife again. I'm not waiting, she said. I'm not angry at her. I can't spend time waiting for my mother to come around. I know. Vivian looked around the cabin. The repaired stove, the map Cole had made pinned above the table, the 3 notebooks on the shelf, the coat that still hung by the door. Is that hers? The coat. Ruth glanced at it. I don't know. It was here when I arrived. You kept it. I didn't have a reason to throw it out. Vivian looked at her with something complicated. You're more generous than you think you are, she said. I'm practical, Ruth said. Sometimes those are the same thing. Cole came back in from the horses, and the conversation shifted to other things. And that evening, the 3 of them sat around the table after supper, and Cole produced his notebooks and, without being asked, opened one and read Vivian 2 observations about elk behavior that were, Ruth had to admit, genuinely interesting. Vivian listened with real attention and asked a question that was better than most questions, and Cole answered it at length, which was more words in a row than Ruth had heard him use on a single subject since January. She sat with her hands around her cup and listened to her husband talk to her sister, and felt something that was not quite happiness, but was in the same territory, warm and specific and entirely present. Vivian left on a Friday morning. She hugged Ruth hard and said, Write more. Not to me. Write to her. She won't say she wants it, but she does. I'll think about it. That means no. That means I'll think about it, Ruth said. Vivian climbed back into the freight wagon and rode down the trail toward Harlan's Crossing, and Ruth watched the wagon go until the trees took it, and then she went back to work. She wrote to Eleanor that evening. Not a long letter, not an apologetic letter. She had nothing to apologize for, and she wasn't going to manufacture it. She wrote about the barn and the garden and the jays on the north slope who came down before storms. She wrote 1 sentence about Cole. He is a good man in the ways that matter, and we are working out the rest as we go. She didn't ask for approval. She didn't explain herself. She just described the life she was living as plainly and honestly as she could, and folded it and addressed it and set it with the next batch of things to go to Harlan's Crossing. Eleanor wrote back in 2 weeks. 3 sentences. The post is doing better. Frank Odom's boy is a hard worker. I hope you are warm. Ruth read it twice and put it in the drawer with Vivian's letters, and that was enough. For now, it was enough. Summer turned the valley into something almost extravagant. Ruth, who had known the North Country only in its winter and early spring severity, was not prepared for what it did in July and August. The meadow grass knee-high and thick with wildflowers, the creek dropping and slowing to a green-gold clarity, the light lasting so late into the evening that you'd look up from what you were doing and be surprised to find it was 9 o'clock and still bright. The mountains that had been white-peaked from November through May showed bare gray rock now, enormous and close-seeming in the clear summer air. She expanded the garden along the south wall. She'd started it small in the spring, practical things, root vegetables and herbs. But summer made her ambitious, and she added a second bed and a third, working the soil in the early mornings before the heat built, finding a satisfaction in it she hadn't anticipated. Her father had kept a small kitchen garden behind the trading post, and she'd helped him with it as a child, and she hadn't thought about it in years. But the smell of turned earth in the early morning brought it back with a specificity that surprised her. His hands in the dirt beside hers, patient and unhurried, naming things as he planted them like he was introducing her to people she'd want to know. Cole watched the garden expand with what she had come to recognize as his version of impressed, a careful attention that didn't editorialize. "You know what you're doing," he said one evening, looking at the 3 beds. "My father taught me." She was kneeling at the edge of the furthest bed, pulling something that had no business being there. "And some of it I've just worked out. The bean plants—" He crouched beside her, looking at a row of climbing beans she'd managed to get established against the south wall. "Those are further along than I'd expect for this altitude. I started them inside in April, transplanted when the frost risk dropped." He looked at her. "In what?" "Tins. I saved tins from the winter stores, poked holes in the bottoms." She sat back on her heels. "I read about it somewhere. Didn't know if it would work." "It worked. It worked this year," she said. "Ask me again next spring." But they both knew from the way the plants looked that it would work next spring too, and the spring after that. She had a feel for growing things. Not magic, not instinct, just the particular combination of observation and patience that made the difference between a person who could garden and a person who couldn't. It was in August that she first knew she was pregnant. She didn't tell Cole immediately, not because she was uncertain. She'd known her own body well enough, and the signs were clear once she was paying attention, but because she needed a few days to sit with the knowledge herself before she shared it, to turn it over, to feel the full weight of what it meant, not just practically, but in the wider sense. A child in this place. Her child. The child of a woman nobody had wanted to choose. She told him on a Tuesday evening after supper while they were sitting on the porch steps Cole had built in May. Proper steps, not the original slab of timber, steps with a railing. Looking at the long summer light across the meadow, she said, "I'm going to have a child." Cole went very still. Not the stillness of shock, exactly, but the stillness of a man who'd had a significant thing happen and was letting it arrive at full size before he responded to it. She waited, watching the meadow. Then he said, "When?" "February, I think, maybe early March." He was quiet for another moment. "Are you—" He stopped, started again. "How are you?" It was the right question, not "are you sure?" or "what do we do?" or any of the other things a person might have led with. She was glad it was the right question. "I'm well," she said. "A little tired in the mornings. Otherwise well." He put his hand over hers on the porch railing. Not a grip, just a covering, his hand over hers, warm and careful. She turned her hand over and held his. They sat there until the light finally gave out entirely, which took a long time in August, and neither of them said much, and what needed to be said had been said. The fever came in September. It came without significant warning, the way fevers did. A morning when Ruth woke feeling wrong, the specific wrongness of a body beginning to fight something, and then 2 days of managing it, believing it would pass. And then on the 3rd day, it did not pass, but instead climbed. And by evening of the 3rd day, she was shaking with chills under 2 blankets in the loft, while Cole sat on the edge of the mattress with his hand on her forehead, and his face doing something she'd never seen it do before. He was scared. She could see it clearly, through the fog of the fever. Not panic. Cole was not a man who panicked, but something beneath his usual steadiness that she recognized as fear because she'd felt it herself and knew its particular quality, the controlled quality of someone holding something together by effort. "It's a fever," she said. Her voice sounded wrong to her own ears, thick and far away. "I know what it is." He got up and came back with a cold cloth and put it on her forehead with a care that was almost painfully gentle. "How bad is your head?" "Bad?" She closed her eyes. "Not the worst. I'm going to get Doc Prentice from Harlan's Crossing. It's 11 miles. It's dark. I'll leave at first light." His voice was steady, but something underneath it wasn't. "Cole, Ruth." The way he said her name made her open her eyes. He was looking at her with the full weight of his attention, nothing reserved, nothing held back. "You are 4 months pregnant and you have a high fever. I'm going to get the doctor." She looked at him, at the fear that he was managing and not hiding, at the hand that was still holding the cloth against her forehead with that careful steadiness. "All right," she said. He left at first light. She heard him in the dark before dawn, moving quietly through the cabin below, stoking the fire high so the cabin would stay warm, leaving water within reach, checking things with the same thoroughness he'd used the first time he left for the range. She lay in the loft and listened, and the fever made the sounds strange and close and far away at the same time. Then she heard his horse leave the yard, the hoofbeats going south through the timber, getting quieter, and then she was alone. The next 2 days were the worst of her life. She knew it even through the fever. A part of her stayed clear enough to understand what was happening, which was both a mercy and a torment. The fever climbed on the first day and stayed high, and she drank water from the bucket Cole had left within reach and put cold cloths on her own forehead when the first ones warmed, and she counted her breaths when the chills came, because counting was something to hold on to. She thought about the child. She thought about it with a fierce, concentrated attention that she couldn't have explained, but not praying, not bargaining, just thinking about it the way she thought about things that mattered, with everything she had. She thought about her father's hands in the garden dirt. She thought about Cole's map with "For Ruth" at the top. She thought about Vivian saying she deserves something that's hers in the kitchen of the trading post, which felt like years ago and also last week. She did not die. She hadn't planned to. Cole came back on the second day with Doc Prentice from Harlan's Crossing, a tired man in his 50s who climbed the loft ladder with the agility of someone who'd done it in worse circumstances and examined Ruth with the brisk efficiency of a doctor who didn't have the energy for bedside theater but genuinely wanted his patients to recover. He diagnosed a respiratory infection, left medicine and instructions, told Cole what to watch for, and told Ruth that she'd been sensible about the water and the cold cloths, and that the child seemed in no immediate danger based on what he could assess. Cole paid him and fed him supper and drove him back to the trail and came home and sat beside Ruth in the loft for the rest of that night without sleeping. She woke at some point in the dark, and he was still there, sitting with his back against the wall, and she said, "You should sleep." "I know," he said. He didn't move. "Cole, I'm better. The fever's down." "I know that too." She looked at him in the dark. "You were scared." A long pause. "Yes. So was I." "I know." He turned to look at her. His face in the dark was mostly shadow, but she knew it well enough now to read it without full light. "I kept thinking, on the ride to town and back, I kept thinking about what it would mean if something—" He stopped. I couldn't finish the thought. "I'm here," she said. "I know." He reached over and put his hand on her forearm, not gripping, just resting. "Go back to sleep." She went back to sleep with his hand on her arm, and when she woke in the morning, the fever had broken properly, and the light was coming over the ridge in that long, early way, and the valley was doing what it always did, going about its business regardless of what had happened inside the cabin. And she lay there for a minute, feeling the specific relief of a body that has been through something and come out the other side. Cole was asleep, finally, sitting upright against the wall with his chin dropped to his chest and his breathing deep and even. She looked at him for a long time, at the lines in his face that hadn't been there in October, at the capable hands loose in his lap, at the man who had ridden 11 miles in the dark to get a doctor and then sat up all night and wouldn't finish the thought about what it would mean if she wasn't there. She thought about what Vivian had said. "He looks at you like you're the most reliable thing he's ever found." She'd deflected it at the time. She didn't deflect it now. She reached over and put her hand on his, the way he'd covered hers on the porch railing in August. He woke, the way light sleepers woke, completely and immediately. "I'm all right," she said, before he could ask. He looked at her, really looked, the full assessment. "Yes," he said, "you are." He went down to make coffee, and she lay in the loft a little longer, listening to him move through the cabin below. And she felt something settle in her chest that had nothing to do with the fever breaking, something older and more fundamental than that. She had been right about him. She'd known it before, in March, watching him sand the step. She knew it differently now, less as an assessment, more as a fact that had been tested and held, a thing you'd picked out of the creek and turned over and struck against a rock to see if it was sound. And it was sound, and now you knew. The valley outside was doing its September thing, the meadow grass going gold, the timber on the north slope starting to shift at the tips. Winter coming again. Another winter in this place, with a child on the way and a barn that would hold and a chimney that drew clean and a man downstairs making coffee who wouldn't finish the thought about losing her. She got up carefully, one hand on the loft wall, and started down the ladder. The baby came in late February, which was exactly when Ruth had calculated she would. Her name was Clara. 7 pounds and some, born in the loft of the cabin during a snowstorm that sealed the valley off from the rest of the world for 3 days and made the whole enterprise a matter of Cole riding hard to get the midwife from Harlan's Crossing 2 days before Ruth thought she needed her. He'd insisted, she'd argued, he'd gone anyway, and as it turned out, she'd been glad of it because the labor was long and complicated in ways that the midwife, a blunt, capable woman named Agnes Holt, handled without fuss, and that Ruth, for all her composure, could not have handled alone. Cole spent the labor downstairs. He'd offered to stay and Ruth had said no, not because she didn't want him there, but because she knew herself well enough to know she needed to do this particular thing without being watched by someone who loved her. Agnes had raised an eyebrow at the arrangement but said nothing, which Ruth appreciated. What happened in that loft over the course of 11 hours was between her and her own body, and she'd dealt with enough hard things alone to know she could deal with this one. And she did. When it was over and Agnes had cleaned things up and wrapped Clara in the blanket Ruth had made from wool traded at the Harlan's Crossing post in December, Agnes called down to Cole and said, "You can come up." He came up the ladder with the careful deliberateness of a man who was holding himself very controlled. He looked at Ruth first, one long assessing look, the same look he'd used after the fever. And what he found there must have satisfied him because something in his shoulders lowered. Then he looked at the bundle in Ruth's arms, and he went completely still. "Come here," Ruth said. He sat on the edge of the mattress, and she tilted Clara toward him, and he looked at his daughter with an expression Ruth had never seen on his face before. Open in a way that had no defense in it, no reserve, nothing held back. Like a man who'd spent 30 years being careful about what he showed and had suddenly lost the capacity for it. "She's small," he said. His voice was different. "She's plenty big enough," Agnes said from the ladder. "I've seen smaller do just fine." She descended, giving them privacy, and they heard her moving around in the main room below. Cole reached out and touched Clara's cheek with one finger. The baby's eyes were closed, her face scrunched with the particular intensity of a new person not yet decided about the world. His finger was rough and calloused and enormous next to her face, and he touched her with the same care he used on the notebooks, on the chimney joints, on the sanded step. "Clara," Ruth said. He looked at her. "You decided." "Unless you object." He looked back at the baby. "No," he said. "Clara," testing the word. "It suits her." "I think so too." He sat there a long time, not holding her yet. That would come in its own time when he was ready. Just sitting close, his rough, careful hand resting near her, present in the way he was always present when something mattered. Outside, the storm pushed against the cabin, and the fire in the stove below worked against the cold, and Agnes Holt made something in the kitchen, and the valley was sealed off and white and silent. And in the loft, the three of them were, for the first time, a family. Eleanor came in May. She wrote first, a longer letter than the 3-sentence ones, still not exactly warm but covering more ground, asking practical questions about the trail and what to bring. Ruth wrote back with the practical answers and did not make it into more than it was. Eleanor arrived with Vivian on the freight wagon, looking smaller than Ruth remembered, as people often looked when you hadn't seen them in months, and your idea of them had stayed fixed while the actual person had continued moving through time. She stepped down from the wagon and looked at the homestead with an expression Ruth couldn't read. The barn, solid and straight on its stone foundation. The garden along the south wall, the third beds going in now, the cabin with its good chimney, the corral and the well-maintained horses, the whole functioning, ordered shape of a life built from unfinished materials. Then Ruth came out of the cabin door with Clara on her hip, and Eleanor saw the baby. She crossed the yard without saying anything, and Ruth let her take Clara, who submitted to being held by a stranger with the equanimity of a child who had been handled confidently since birth. Eleanor held her granddaughter and looked at her face, and something happened in Eleanor's expression that Ruth watched without trying to name. "She has your father's ears," Eleanor said finally. Her voice was careful. "I thought so too," Ruth said. A pause. The spring air moved through the yard, carrying the smell of new grass from the meadow. The place is... Eleanor looked around again. Larger than I expected. You said that, Vivian murmured, setting down her bag. I said smaller, Eleanor said. You said it to me before we left, Vivian said. You said it would probably be smaller than Ruth described. Eleanor did not respond to this. She was looking at the barn. You built that? Cole and I built it, Ruth said, last spring. The foundation is stone. Yes. Eleanor pressed her lips together in the way she did when she was revising an opinion and not quite ready to announce the revision. She looked at the cabin, at the garden, at the barn, at the baby in her arms. Ruth watched her mother do the arithmetic of what she was seeing, the evidence of a life that was hard and real and also, undeniably, working. Cole came out of the barn where he'd been doing the morning check. He saw Eleanor and stopped for a moment, then came across the yard. He was not a man who dissembled about how he felt about things, which Ruth had come to trust, and she watched him now to see how he greeted her mother. He greeted her the same way he greeted everyone, directly, without performance. Mrs. Mercer, he said, long ride up from town. It is, Eleanor said. She was still holding Clara. You have good horses. I do, he said. Ruth picked the gray. I'd have passed on him. Eleanor looked at Ruth. You know horses? I know what to look for, Ruth said. Papa showed me. Something crossed Eleanor's face, a complicated something, old and specific, and then it passed and she looked back down at Clara and said, She's healthy? She's very healthy, Ruth said. Ask Agnes Holt if you don't want to take my word for it. I take your word for it. Eleanor said it quietly, and it was not nothing. From Eleanor Mercer, taking someone's word for something without verification was as close to an apology as she'd ever learned to get. They stayed 4 days. It was not easy, and it was not impossible, which was probably the most realistic outcome. Eleanor had opinions about the pantry organization that she expressed with more certainty than the situation warranted, and Ruth let her express them and changed nothing, and after 2 days Eleanor stopped. She held Clara for long stretches, sitting in the chair by the window with the baby sleeping against her shoulder. And her face in those stretches was different than the face Ruth had known all her life. Quieter, less arranged, like a woman who had set down something heavy and wasn't sure whether to pick it back up. On the third evening, Cole took Vivian out to see the horses because Vivian had expressed genuine curiosity, and because Cole, Ruth had noticed, recognized when people needed to be elsewhere. He was good at that. He understood the geometry of conversations. Ruth and Eleanor were alone in the cabin for the first time. Eleanor in the chair with the sleeping Clara, Ruth at the table with coffee. Eleanor said, I was wrong. Ruth looked at her cup. About which of you? Eleanor stopped, tried again. I had it backwards. I thought Vivian was the one who needed protecting, and you were the one who could manage without it. A pause. I had it backwards. Ruth was quiet for a moment. Vivian can manage, she said. She's managing the post. I know she is. That's what I mean. Eleanor looked at the sleeping baby. I taught her to be pretty and charming because I thought those were the things that would protect her. And I left you to figure out everything else because I thought you could take it. She was quiet. Both things were wrong. Vivian did all right. Vivian did all right because she's stronger than I gave her credit for and smarter than I bothered to notice, Eleanor said. Same as you. I underestimated both of you in different directions. Ruth looked at her mother, at the lines in her face that had deepened in the year since the wedding, at her hands, competent and familiar, cupped around Clara's small back. I know you were scared, Ruth said, about the post, about what would happen to us. I was always scared, Eleanor said. Since your father died, I have been scared every single day. She said it flatly, not asking for sympathy. And scared people make bad decisions. I made some bad ones. You also made some good ones, Ruth said. You kept the post going. You kept us fed. That's a low bar. It's not nothing. Eleanor looked at her daughter across the room with something that had been a long time coming. No, she said. I suppose not. They didn't resolve everything that evening. There wasn't a resolution, exactly. No single moment of reckoning that set everything right. Eleanor was still Eleanor, and Ruth was still Ruth, and the years between them were what they were. But something shifted in the geometry of the thing, some weight redistributed. And when Eleanor left on the fourth day, she hugged Ruth longer than she had at the wedding. And when she pulled back, her eyes were wet, though she didn't acknowledge it. And she said, "Write more." "I will," Ruth said. "To me. Not just to Vivian." "To you," Ruth agreed. Eleanor climbed onto the freight wagon, and Vivian hugged Ruth and whispered, "I told you she'd get there." And then the wagon went down the trail through the timber, and the valley returned to its ordinary quiet, and Ruth stood in the yard holding Clara and watched them go. Cole came to stand beside her. "How was it?" he asked. "Hard," she said. "And okay." She shifted Clara to her other hip, both at the same time. "That seems right," he said. "It does," she agreed. The years that followed built on each other the way good work built, not quickly or dramatically, but with the accumulating weight of things done right. Clara was 2 when they added a second room to the cabin, a proper bedroom with a real floor, no warped boards. She was 3 when Ruth put in the 4th garden bed and started selling surplus vegetables to the trading post in Harlan's Crossing, a small income stream that grew over the following years into something worth accounting for. Cole's trap lines had a run of genuinely good seasons through the early 1860s. The fur prices holding, his reputation in the trade solid enough that younger trappers started asking his advice on the North Range routes. A son came when Clara was 4. They named him James, after Ruth's father. He was loud and determined from his first weeks and grew into a child who approached every object in the world as if it were personally constructed to be climbed, which kept Ruth alert in ways she hadn't anticipated. Cole handled James with a patience that Ruth observed and found quietly remarkable. Not the easy patience of someone for whom it cost nothing, but the deliberate patience of someone who'd grown up without a father and was figuring out what one did by thinking hard about it and then doing the opposite of what had been done to him. He was not a perfect father. He was sometimes too quiet, sometimes in his own head when James needed more engagement, sometimes unreliable about remembering the small things, the birthday, the special occasion, the promised trip to Harlan's Crossing to see the new freight horses. Ruth told him when he missed these things, directly and without extended lecture, and he listened and tried to do better, and mostly he did, and sometimes he forgot again, and they managed it. That was what managing a life with another person looked like. Not perfection. Management. The ongoing work of 2 imperfect people trying to do right by each other and the children they'd made. They argued, not constantly, not dramatically, but with the honest regularity of 2 people who had strong views and lived in close quarters and were not afraid of conflict. They argued about money twice, once when Cole wanted to expand the trap line further north than Ruth thought was safely manageable for one man, once when Ruth wanted to invest in sheep that Cole thought would be more trouble than the wool was worth. On the first argument, Cole conceded to a compromise route. On the second, Ruth went ahead with the sheep over his objection and turned out to be partially right. The wool income was good, the animal management was exactly as demanding as Cole had predicted, and they both had the grace not to make too much of who'd been proven right about which part. Ruth found out that Willis from the grain supply had said something to a newcomer family in Harlan's Crossing about Cole Brennan's wife. Some version of the old story, the scarred one he'd passed over the pretty one for, a mistake that time would show. She heard about it secondhand from the freight man's wife, who told her with the particular relish of someone delivering news they know will be received as significant. Ruth thought about it for a day. Then she thought about the barn and the garden and the children and the map on the wall and the notebooks on the shelf and the letters from Eleanor that had grown, slowly, over the years, into something that resembled real correspondence. She thought about the sanded step and the cold cloth on her forehead during the fever, and the way Cole had sat in the loft with his hand near Clara's face the night she was born. She did not go to Willis. She did not send a message. She did nothing at all in response to Willis's opinion of her life, because Willis's opinion of her life was exactly as relevant to her life as it had ever been, which was not at all. And she had known that since she was old enough to understand that some people measured worth in ways that had nothing to do with what was actually valuable. She told Cole about it that evening. He listened without interrupting. "Do you want me to say something to him?" he asked. "No?" "Then I won't." He was quiet for a moment. "He said something to me too, before we married, at the boarding house." "I know, I heard." "Did I tell you what I said back?" You said I see fine. He almost smiled. Did I ever tell you what I meant by that? She looked at him. Tell me. I meant... He turned his coffee cup in his hands, the old habit. I meant that I'd looked at you the first day you walked me to the back room to check the traps, and I could see what Willis could see, the scar, the way you held yourself like you were waiting for someone to tell you to move, and I could see what Willis couldn't. He set the cup down. I could see you'd been doing the actual work of keeping that post alive for years and nobody was counting it. I could see you weren't bitter about it, which would have made me trust you less, but you also weren't defeated by it, which is what I needed to know. Ruth was quiet for a moment. That's what you saw in a trading post in October, she said. I'd been alone on a mountain for 3 months, he said. You get good at reading things when you're alone that long. She looked at her husband across the table in the kitchen of the house they'd built together, the house that had been a rough cabin with a leaking chimney and warped floorboards, and was now a place with 4 rooms and 2 children's voices in it, and a barn on a stone foundation, and a garden that fed them and then some. She thought about the woman she'd been that October, behind the counter of a failing trading post, tallying numbers that didn't add up, invisible to almost everyone who walked through the door. She thought about what it had cost to say yes, the leaving, the cold ride up the trail, the first night in an unfamiliar loft listening to unfamiliar sounds, the months of building something from nothing, of being alone in a valley when a person you'd come to count on was 20 miles up a mountain, the fever, the fear, the long, slow work of becoming someone's partner in the real sense, not the ceremonial one. She thought about what she'd said to Cole on their second night in this cabin. This is mine. Whatever happens here, I'm part of it. She still believed it, more than she had when she'd said it, because she knew now what it meant to own a thing. Not legally, not in the abstract, but in the bones and calluses way of people who have put their actual lives into something and watched it grow beyond what they'd imagined possible. Willis never could see that far, she said. No, Cole agreed, he couldn't. That was the end of the conversation about Willis. He was never mentioned again. Clara grew up knowing how to read a weather pattern off the ridge, and how to pack clay into chimney joints, and how to keep accounts in a ledger without fudging the numbers when they came out wrong. She was 12 when she told her mother that she wanted to be a doctor, which was an ambitious thing for a girl in Montana Territory in 1870 to want. Ruth looked at her daughter with her father's dark hair and her own unflinching directness and the total absence of any impulse to apologize for taking up space, and said, "Then figure out how. Doc Prentice says women can't study medicine." Doc Prentice is 63 years old, Ruth said. The world has time to change before you're ready to practice. Clara looked at her with the expression of a child who is deciding whether to believe something. Do you think it will? Ruth thought about Willis's opinion and what it had cost her. She thought about Eleanor in the chair with a sleeping baby, setting down something heavy. She thought about what it meant to be a woman who was counted, not praised, not elevated, just counted, by one person who looked carefully and saw clearly. I think, Ruth said, that you should spend less time asking whether the world will change, and more time being one of the reasons it does. Clara considered this. Then she went back to the book she'd borrowed from Doc Prentice's shelf, which she'd been reading despite his opinion on the subject of women in medicine, and Ruth watched her read and thought, yes, that one will be all right. That one will be more than all right. The years kept building. James grew into a young man who had his father's quietness and his mother's stubbornness, which was a combination that served him well in some circumstances and got him into trouble in others. Vivian married a decent man from Billings and had 2 children and kept running the Mercer trading post with a competence that Eleanor eventually acknowledged openly, which from Eleanor was essentially a speech. Eleanor herself made it to 67 before her heart gave out on a Tuesday morning in March, quickly and without much warning, which was the way she would have wanted to go, efficiently, without fuss, on her own schedule. Ruth went back to Harlan's Crossing for the burial. She stood at the grave in the cold spring air with Vivian beside her, and she thought about 3 sentences in a letter. The post is doing better. Frank Odom's boy is a hard worker. I hope you are warm. She thought about how far her mother had come from that letter to the one she'd sent the year before she died, 4 pages long, describing in detail the post's new inventory system, and asking Ruth's opinion on whether to stock a new line of dry goods, and mentioning, in the second-to-last paragraph, almost incidentally, that she was proud of what Ruth had built, I'm proud of what you've built, she'd written. 4 words. After everything. Ruth had folded the letter and put it in the drawer and sat with it for a long time. She stood at the grave and felt the weight of her mother and did not try to reduce it to something simpler than it was. Eleanor had been wrong about important things and right about others, and had loved her children in the ways she knew how to love them, which were imperfect ways, which was the most honest thing that could be said about almost anyone. Ruth did not need her mother to have been a better person than she was. She just needed to have understood her well enough to stop waiting for permission. That was the thing nobody had told her when she was young, that the waiting was the trap. That standing in the back room of a trading post doing the actual work while everyone looked at someone else was not something you survived by learning to be seen. It was something you survived by deciding that being seen was not the point. The point was the work. The point was whether the work was real, whether what you built held up, whether the people you built it with could say, honestly, that you'd been there. Cole was waiting at the homestead when she came back from Harlan's Crossing. He was on the porch steps, the proper steps with the railing, sanded and solid, and he had coffee ready, which was his way of saying he knew she'd need something to hold. She sat down beside him and took the cup, and they looked out at the valley. The meadow was coming back after winter, the first green showing through the dead grass. The creek was running loud with snowmelt. The barn stood solid on its stone foundation. The garden beds along the south wall were ready for planting. The soil turned, waiting. How was it? He asked. Hard and okay, she said. The way things are. He nodded. They sat in the late afternoon light and drank their coffee. And across the valley the ridge held its shape against the sky, enormous and indifferent and also, somehow, familiar. Ruth had learned the valley the way she'd learned the trading post, by working it until she knew it in her bones. The places where the water ran and where it didn't, the angle of the light in each season, the behavior of the jays before a storm. She was 42 years old. Her hands were rough, and her hair was going gray at the temples, and the scar along her jaw had faded to a fine silver line that she had not thought about in years. She had built a barn and raised 2 children and fixed a chimney and kept a human being alive through a fever and a snowstorm and argued about foundations and been wrong sometimes and right sometimes and had been counted every single day by the man sitting beside her, who was not an easy man and not a simple man and was exactly what he had said he was, someone who looked carefully and told the truth about what he saw. There was no grand speech about what it all meant. Cole was not a man for grand speeches, and she was not a woman who needed one. They sat on the porch in the spring light, and the valley went about its business, and it was enough, more than enough. It was the particular fullness of a life that had been built rather than given, which was the only kind of full that stayed full, that didn't leak out around the edges when nobody was looking. She had been, once, the woman nobody chose. She thought about that sometimes. Not with bitterness, not anymore, but with the particular clarity of someone who could look back across a long distance and see the shape of a thing from a vantage point that had once been impossible to reach. She thought about Ruth Mercer, behind the counter of a failing post with a bent pen nib and numbers that wouldn't balance, waiting to be counted. She was not waiting anymore. She put down her coffee cup and stood up. Cole looked at her. Garden won't plant itself, she said. He stood up too, with the slight stiffness of a man in his mid-40s who'd spent 30 years doing physical work in cold country, and they went down the porch steps together and crossed the yard and got to work. That was how love looked in the end. Not in the moment of choosing, and not in the ceremony of it, and not even in the hard seasons that tested whether you'd chosen right. It looked like 2 people in a garden in spring, planting things in cold ground because they'd be there when the things came up. It looked like showing up, day after day, for the life you'd said yes to. It looked like ordinary and imperfect and entirely, stubbornly real. That was all it was. That was everything.